Sewing Studio have persuaded me to give away 10 of my top tips. Now these tips are going to help you to be more accurate with your patchwork and get better results. When I'm teaching, these are the tips that I give to my students to help them get the best results possible. So tip number 1 is going to make it easier for you to cut your fabric, and it's going to make it more accurate for you. So how? So we're going to use one of these best press starches, and we're going to spray a little light starch onto our fabric before we cut. Tip number 2 is to make sure that you cut as accurately as possible, and to make life easy for you, always make sure that you've got a nice sharp blade and that your blade hasn't got any little nicks in it where you might have gone over a pin. It sounds simple, but it's always worth making sure that you've checked your blade. Earlier, I know that I went over the tip of a pin with this, so this is what happens. And you will always, so you can see here, it hasn't gone all the way through and it's just missed it there. And whilst you can get a pair of scissors and you can snip it, you're never going to be as accurate as if you've got a nice sharp blade in there. So tip number 3, now I've got a nice new blade in my cutter, is to use the ruler to cut, not the mat. And the reason for this is it's going to give you a much more accurate cut. For example, if you've got to cut 3.5 inches and you measure it on your mat, it's not going to be as accurate as if you put your ruler here first and you put your ruler over the top. You've got a nice straight edge here. 1, 2, 3.5. And that's going to give you a much more accurate cut. So here's why I wouldn't suggest doing it with the mat. So we're going to measure 3.5 inches. So we'll line that up and we're going to put that on there. And how do we know that that is exactly a half? Because up here it's moved fractionally. So it's not nice and straight because I'm going between these marks. Whereas with the ruler, I've got that lovely clear straight line. It just makes your life easier and it's much more accurate. So tip number 4 is all about the sewing needle that you have in your machine. You need the right needle for the right job, and this will help you to be more accurate. So if you use a good quality needle and you use size 70, that is a narrower needle than if you used a universal 90. And the reason for this is, if you've got a bigger needle going into your fabric, it's going to make your seam fractionally bigger. So it's really important to have the right size needle to keep your seams as accurate and as near to the 1/4 inch as possible. So tip number 5, let's talk about thread. So to keep your seams nice and accurate at a 1/4 inch, you need the right weight thread, and it should be a cotton thread, and it should be no more than a 50 weight. 60 weight is perfect because it's a nice thin thread but strong enough to hold your pieces together. So if you use a polyester thread when you're sewing cotton, you won't get such good results, and if your thread is too thick, then it will affect the width of your seams. Tip number 6 is all about the foot that is on your machine. So you need a 1/4 inch foot to help keep your seams at a 1/4 inch. And the one that is my favourite is this one with the guide here, so that the fabric is kept within that line and therefore you can't go over a 1/4 inch or under a 1/4 inch. A lot of people use masking tape to mark out their 1/4 inch, or they use a different foot, but if you want really accurate seams, then the 1/4 inch foot with a guide is the way to go. So tip number 7 is all about posture and accuracy. So sit straight at your sewing machine, because if you sit sideways, you may not be as accurate and watching this guide go down the edge of your fabric, so you're not going to get the best results. It also helps with your posture, so if you're doing a lot of sewing, you're not going to end up with a backache at the end of the day. So tip number 8 is all about your bobbin, and this is one of my favourite tips. It's something that I always do when I start a new quilt project. I wind 2 bobbins, and the reason for this is when you run out of thread partway through and you need to wind another bobbin, you haven't got to take your top thread off to wind it on and then thread your top thread. You've got your second bobbin ready to go, and you just take it off and pop it in when you need to. So tip number 9 is all about how you press your fabric. So we want to set our seams to help with the accuracy, because if we just press without setting the seams, we can have some stretch in our fabric. So if we just go straight to the iron and we just press it, we can have some of these move a little bit. So what I do is I set my seam, and what do I mean by that? I press along the line that I've just sewn to set the seam, and then I press all the seams flat in one direction. And that will help when you come to join it to your row, that you'll get a nice accurate cross and your patchwork won't be out of line. And last but not least, tip number 10 is about pinning. So when you're going to join one row to the next row, to help with your accuracy, you should start pinning from the center and work out. So you start here, and you want nice sharp pins. Oops, not a bent one like that one. We need to get rid of that. So we would pin our middle piece, and then we would go to one side and pin the next piece, and then we'd go back to this side and pin this piece. And now I'm going to show you what happens if you start at one end. So I'm just going to start at one end, and I'm going to pin all the way along. And already you can see here that this join is out. They're not meeting together so well. So I've got this little bit of extra here. And if I continued to the end, you can see that I'm almost 1/4 of an inch out, and that's going to show somewhere on my row. So that's why it's really important to start at the middle and work out. And they are my top tips for perfect patchwork piecing. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I'm sure there's lots of tips out there. There's probably lots that I don't know, so I'd love to hear from you for your top tips. So please leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time here in the Sewing Studio.